The morning my uncle told me I had 48 hours to clear out of the house I grew up in, it was snowing. Not the soft, cinematic kind of snow you see on Christmas cards. The kind that comes sideways off Lake Ontario in November, wet and mean, the kind that gets inside your collar no matter what you do. I remember standing in the front hallway, still in my work boots, still holding my bag from the job site. My uncle, my mother's older brother, the one who'd taken over managing the family's property development firm after my mother passed, was sitting in the kitchen like he owned the place, which, as of 3 weeks earlier, he legally did. "The estate's been settled, Callum," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "The house transfers to the company Monday morning. You're not on the deed, you're not in the will. That's just how it is," I said. "She was my mother." He finally looked at me. "She was. And she made her choices. So now you make yours. My name is Callum Reed. I was 31 years old. I had a truck, a toolbox, $1,400 in a checking account, and a storage unit full of my mother's furniture that I had no room to keep. And somewhere outside of Minden, Ontario, about 2.5 hours north of the city, I had a grandfather I hadn't seen in 11 years, and a piece of land he'd left me that I'd basically forgotten existed. My grandfather, my father's father, was a man named Hugh Reed. He died when I was 19 during my second year of a construction program at college. He left me a parcel of land on a small lake in Haliburton County. Not the whole property. Just the back portion, about 3 acres with an old cabin on it that he'd built himself sometime in the early 1970s. The main cottage, the one on the waterfront with the dock and the good view, went to my aunt and her husband. I hadn't thought much about the land since the inheritance. There was no road to it except a rutted track through the bush. The cabin had no insulation, my grandfather had mentioned once. In that way, he had of mentioning things like they were completely ordinary, that the roof needed work and the foundation had shifted. At the time I was 19, living in Barrie, more concerned with passing my framing exam than with a cabin I'd have to drive 2.5 hours to reach. Now I was 31, standing in a hallway with 48 hours to get out. I pulled out of the driveway at 7 in the morning, 2 days later, with the truck loaded and the tailgate held shut with a bungee cord. It was still snowing. The track into the property was worse than I remembered. In the years since I'd last driven it, maybe 8, maybe 9 years back, for a single afternoon visit, the spruce and poplar had pushed in from both sides until the branches scraped both mirrors. There were 2 soft spots where the ground had gone boggy that I had to hit at speed and pray. The second one, I felt the back end drop, and my stomach went with it, but the truck clawed out and I kept going. The cabin sat about 200 meters back from the lake, up a slight rise in the land, surrounded by a stand of old white pines. My grandfather had positioned it there deliberately, he'd once told me, because the pines would break the north wind in winter. Smart, also inconvenient, because it meant no lake view from the windows and a longer walk to the water. I got out of the truck and just stood there for a moment. The porch was half collapsed, one corner post rotted through at the base and the roof sagging to meet the railing. The cedar shingles on the south face had been losing the battle with moss and lichen for years, and at least a quarter of them were either cracked, missing, or curling up at the edges like burnt paper. One of the front windows had a crack running diagonally across the full pane. Not broken through, but close. The door, when I pushed it, swung open on one hinge and scraped across the floor. Inside smelled like cold and thyme, like a drawer you haven't opened in years. Mouse droppings on the kitchen counter, a dead red squirrel in the corner near the wood stove, stiff and dried out, past the point of being unpleasant. The linoleum in the kitchen had buckled and lifted in 2 places. The insulation in the ceiling, just fiberglass bats tacked between the rafters, no vapor barrier, no drywall, had partially fallen in one corner and was hanging down like a gray curtain. But the bones were good. My grandfather had built this cabin with rough-cut lumber from a mill outside Bancroft, and he'd built it the way his generation built things. Over-engineered, paranoid, with no faith in the future's ability to maintain anything. The sill plate was 6 by 8. The floor joists were 2 by 10s on 12-inch centers. The walls were 2x6s when most builders in 1972 were using 2x4s. I knocked on the exterior wall and it knocked back solid. I sat on the one kitchen chair that was still upright and looked around and thought about my uncle's face when he'd told me to leave, and I thought, all right. I had $1,400, a full set of hand tools, and a circular saw. I did not have a generator. The property had no hydro, and wouldn't, because running a line 200 meters through the bush would cost more than I had. I'd bought a small propane unit in Minden on the way in, along with $50 worth of groceries, a case of water jugs, and 2 extra propane canisters. The first week was about understanding what I was dealing with. I pulled the porch apart by hand, prying the rotten boards up one by one and stacking the ones that could be salvaged. The post that had failed was eaten through by carpenter ants. I found the whole colony, still half alive in the November chill, nested in the wood where it met the ground. I spent an afternoon digging out the concrete pad the post had sat on, leveling it, mixing a new footing by hand in a borrowed wheelbarrow. The roof was the thing that scared me. I'd done roofing work before. I'd spent 2 summers on a crew in the Kawarthas, doing mostly residential re-roofing, but doing it alone, on a ladder, in November, on a building where the underlying structure was unknown, was something else. I ordered materials from a building supply place in Haliburton and arranged delivery for the following week, which cost me $300 I didn't really have and left me with just over $1,000. While I waited, I stripped the interior. The old fiberglass insulation came down in chunks, filling the cabin with fine glass particles that settled on every surface and made my forearms itch for days. I pulled the linoleum up with a flat bar, found good tongue-and-groove pine underneath, scratched and but. I pulled the kitchen cabinets off the wall. They were particle board, swollen and ruined, and stacked them outside to burn. I swept and swept and swept again. At night, I ate beans heated on the propane burner and read on my phone until the battery died. I'd drive out to Minden every few days to charge everything at the Tim Hortons and use their Wi-Fi to look up whatever I'd run into that week. How to repoint a stone foundation, how to repair a rotted sill plate, what to do about a chimney flue with a cracked liner. There's a lot you can learn for free if you're patient enough to look. My aunt called once in those first weeks. She wanted to know what I was doing up there, as she put it, as if Haliburton were the Arctic. Fixing the cabin, I said. Silence. Then, that old thing? Callum. It's not worth putting money into. Good thing I don't have any money, I said, and hung up. The roof took me 9 days. I'm not going to pretend it was perfect, because it wasn't, and I know the difference. But it was watertight, and it was sound, and I'd replaced the damaged sheathing and installed proper underlayment and new architectural shingles. And when the first real snowfall came in early December, I lay on my sleeping bag in the cabin and listened to the silence and knew nothing was coming through. I reframed the porch with lumber I'd salvaged and supplemented from the offcuts the delivery driver had left. I rehung the front door, properly, both hinges, a new threshold, and it swung clean and latched firm. I replaced the cracked window pane myself, something I'd watched a YouTube video on 3 times before attempting. The wood stove, at least, was solid, a cast iron Findlay oval, older than me, that my grandfather had installed himself and that burned with a low, even heat that, once I'd cleaned the flue and confirmed the liner was intact, could warm the whole cabin in about 40 minutes. I was down to just under $300. I started doing day labor through a guy I knew who ran a small renovation crew out of Haliburton Village. Cash work, nothing fancy, mostly demo and framing. It kept me in groceries and propane and let me put a little back toward materials. I worked 5 days a week and came back to the cabin in the evenings and kept going on my own project on weekends and whatever daylight was left. By January, I had the interior walls drywalled. By February, I had them taped, mudded, and painted, a warm off-white that made the space feel larger than it was. I'd found a second-hand cast-iron kitchen sink at a Habitat for Humanity restore in Lindsay for $40. I plumbed it to a gravity-fed tank I'd rigged in the loft, not elegant, but functional. I built the kitchen cabinets myself from pine boards I milled on a table saw I'd borrowed indefinitely from the guy on the crew, rough and simple, but level and square. It was starting to look like something. I could feel it happening, the way a building that's been given up on starts to find its shape again when someone decides to pay attention. It was my grandfather's bedroom that stopped me. The bedroom at the back of the cabin. His room, the one that had looked out over the pines and the lake beyond, was the last room I tackled. I'd been saving it, in a way I couldn't fully explain. It was the room where his smell lingered longest, or where I imagined it did. Cedar and machine oil and the specific dry warmth of an old wood-heated house. I was in there in the third week of February, measuring for the new window trim when I noticed it. The room was not large, maybe 11 by 12 feet. But when I measured wall to wall, the interior dimensions didn't add up to the exterior. I'm in the trades. I've spent years knowing by feel when a room is the size it should be. There was a discrepancy on the north wall, the one that ran along the back of the cabin, about 2.5 feet, maybe a bit more. I stood there for a long time, measuring again, looking at the wall. It was the same cedar tongue and groove as the rest of the interior, same weathered gray finish. No seams that didn't belong, no obvious door or hatch, but when I pressed my knuckles against it, not the hard knock of a builder testing structure, just a quiet tap, I heard it, hollow. I sat down on the edge of what had been my grandfather's bed frame, just the bare metal, and I looked at that wall. I thought about the man who built this cabin, Hugh Reed, who had been an electrician by trade, who drove an old Chevy pickup until it quit, and then drove another one, who said almost nothing about almost everything, who had given me this piece of land without ever explaining why he'd chosen me over anyone else in the family. Why would a man who measured twice and cut once, who had built this cabin down to the last detail with intention, why would that man build a false wall in his own bedroom? I got my pry bar. I didn't go through it like someone tearing down a building. I went through it like someone trying to understand something. I found the seam eventually, along the top plate, where the false wall met the ceiling. It was fitted so cleanly that if I hadn't been looking for it, if I hadn't had the measuring tape telling me the room was wrong, I would never have seen it. My grandfather had built it, and my grandfather was good. It came down in sections. The cedar boards were nailed to a secondary stud wall, 2x4s, real ones, not the economical stuff, set about 30 inches in from the exterior. The space behind was clean, bone dry, no moisture, no mold, no rot, which meant it had been sealed well from the beginning, not as an afterthought. On the floor of the cavity, there was a wooden crate, old, rough-cut, the kind of thing you'd build in an afternoon from scraps. About the size of a small trunk, sealed with a hasp and a padlock, a standard brass padlock of the kind that costs $4 at a hardware store, and that I opened in about 30 seconds with a flathead screwdriver and a piece of wire. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a tin box, the kind they used to sell at Canadian Tire for keeping documents. Fireproof, the label said, though I had no way of testing that claim, and inside the tin box was a letter. My grandfather's handwriting was small and careful and vertical, the handwriting of a man who'd learned penmanship in a school that took it seriously. The letter was 2 pages, written on plain white paper, dated September of the year he died. I won't reproduce it word for word. Some of it is private, and some of it concerns my family in ways that belong to us. But the part that matters, the part that changed everything, was this. He knew the family land was going to be a problem when he was gone. He'd watched the same thing happen to his own parents' property, watched it get subdivided and sold off piece by cousins who needed money and couldn't agree on anything. He didn't want that for the lake property. He had, over a period of about 20 years, acquired something. He'd worked extra jobs, weekend electrical work, side contracts, cash work in the summers, and he'd put the money somewhere that wasn't a bank account where it could be found, argued over, claimed against, taxed at the wrong moment. He'd put it into something portable, something real, something that a person who knew to look in the right place would find. Bearer bonds are an old instrument. You don't see them much now. The government largely eliminated them in Canada years ago, because they were too easy to use for tax avoidance, but the existing ones remained valid. My grandfather had purchased them through a broker in the 1980s and 1990s, a small stack at a time, whenever he had the cash. The face value of what was in that crate, which I counted twice, sitting cross-legged on the floor of his bedroom in a cabin I'd spent 5 months rebuilding with my own hands, was $1,240,000. I sat with that number for a long time. I counted the certificates again. I did not move for probably an hour. Then I made myself a coffee on the propane burner and sat at the kitchen table I'd built from pine boards and looked out the window I'd re-glazed myself at the snow coming off the pines. And I thought about what my grandfather had said in the letter. He'd said he was leaving the certificates to whoever he knew would be there, not the fastest to arrive, not the loudest at the reading of the will, the one who stayed. He'd known I would come back, or he'd hoped I would, and he'd built the wall so that only someone who rebuilt the room would find it. I called no one that night. I put the tin box under my sleeping platform, the one I'd built from 2x6s in the corner of the main room. I ate dinner. I slept. The brokerage my grandfather had used still existed, absorbed twice over into larger institutions, but still traceable. A financial advisor in Peterborough, I found through a lawyer, helped me work through the process of valuing and liquidating the certificates. It took 3 months, involved more paperwork than I have ever dealt with before or since, and required me to establish very clearly that I was the legal heir to the contents of that cabin, which my name on the land title helped considerably. My aunt found out in April, when the lawyer sent a routine notification. She called me. Then her husband called me. Then my uncle, the one who had told me to get out of my mother's house in the snow, called me. 3 separate calls on the same afternoon, each one escalating in a way I found almost professionally impressive. My uncle's argument was that the certificates had been part of my grandfather's estate and should have been included in the original distribution. My lawyer's response was straightforward. The certificates were not listed in the estate because they were not known to exist. They were discovered in the course of improvement works on property titled solely in my name. The property? The cabin, the contents of the cabin, all mine. Finders keepers was not a legal principle, he used those words, but it was what he meant. There was talk of a challenge. There were emails I chose not to read fully. There was a phone call from my aunt that lasted 20 minutes, in which she said a number of things I won't repeat, and at the end of which I said, very quietly, "You told me the property wasn't worth putting money into. You were wrong." Nothing came of the challenge. There was nothing to challenge. By May, the cabin was finished. Not finished the way a show home is finished, or the way a renovation magazine would describe finished. Finished the way a thing is finished when it works, when it's warm, when it's yours. The floors refinished and sealed. The kitchen functional and clean. The porch rebuilt with pressure-treated posts and a cedar deckboard floor and a new railing that I'd routed a simple profile into just because I felt like it, just because my grandfather would have done the same. The bedroom at the back, his bedroom, now mine, with a proper vapor barrier and new insulation and drywall, and a window I'd replaced with a larger one that looked out over the pines toward the water. I bought a second-hand canoe from a guy in Carnarvon and paddled out on the lake the morning after I got it, in the early fog, before the loons had started up. The water was still cold. The air smelled like spruce and mud, and whatever it is that spring smells like in the Canadian Shield, that iron-cold, clean smell that has no name I know. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the fact that he'd built a wall, and waited, and trusted that someone would come along who would tear it down carefully enough to understand what they were finding. I thought about the 48 hours of snow in November, and the truck with the bungee cord on the tailgate, and how I'd driven north with nowhere else to go. The money changed things. I won't pretend it didn't. It bought me time. Time to stop doing day labor, time to finish the cabin properly, time to think about what came next. I've since started a small contracting business out of Haliburton, just me and 2 guys I trust, doing the kind of careful renovation work that the cottage country up here needs badly and doesn't always get. We do good work. We don't cut corners. My grandfather would have approved, I think. He was a man who believed that the quality of what you build is the only argument you ever need to make. The last thing I did, in those final weeks of finishing the cabin, was patch the north wall of the bedroom. Not rebuild it. I had no reason to hide anything. Just close it up clean. New drywall, taped and mudded and painted the same warm white as the rest of the room. But I left the crate. I put it back on the floor where I'd found it, empty now, the lid open. I don't know exactly why. Something about wanting to remember the shape of the thing before I knew what was inside it, the not yet knowing. The hollow sound of a knuckle on cedar, the particular stillness of a February afternoon in the bush when the only sound is your own breathing and the fire in the stove. My grandfather built something and hid it and waited for the right person to find it. The least I can do is keep the evidence.